Welcome to the Lion's Share podcast, where we break down today's most impactful research and bring fresh insights from the academic frontier straight to you.
Okay, let's unpack this.
All right.
You've brought us a fascinating piece of research today, a deep dive into M&A disclosures. Specifically, Ron Shalev's 2009 paper from the Accounting Review.
That's right. It's all about the information, or maybe the lack of information, in those business combination footnotes.
And it sounds like it's not just dry accounting details. There's some real strategy, maybe even some deception involved.
Exactly. Our mission today really is to walk through this study using 6 key questions. We want to show you how Shalev demonstrated that M&A disclosure is highly strategic.
And that the market, well, it doesn't always get the message right away.
Precisely. It often misses the signal when it matters most.
Okay, so let's start big picture. What's the central mystery Shalev was trying to solve here? What are the, say, top 3 takeaways we need to grasp up front?
Well, the core research question was pretty fundamental. What drives the differences we see in how much companies disclose about their acquisitions? And crucially, does that level of disclosure actually tell us anything useful about future performance or how investors react?
And the answers sound, well, a bit concerning for investors. What was the first key finding?
Finding 1 is really about manager incentives. Basically, managers tend to provide less disclosure. They kind of clam up when the deal might be seen as bad news.
Bad news like they paid too much.
That's a big part of it. The study specifically linked less disclosure to abnormally high levels of goodwill allocation. That can signal overpayment or maybe even strategically inflating goodwill to smooth out future earnings, especially since goodwill isn't amortized anymore under SFAS 141.
Okay, so if a manager suspects they overpaid or they want to manage earnings perceptions later, the incentive is to just disclose the minimum required.
That seems to be the pattern, yes. Then finding 2 flips the coin and shows that this disclosure level actually is valuable information.
How so?
Acquisitions where managers provided more disclosure than expected, what Shalev calls abnormal disclosure, actually tended to perform better down the road.
Better performance measured by
things like improved return on assets, ROA, and also higher long-term abnormal stock returns. So the completeness of the disclosure itself was a positive signal about the deal's quality.
Right, which leads logically to the third finding, and this is the one that always surprises me. If more disclosure signals a better deal long-term, you'd think the market would jump on that information immediately when the 10K comes out.
You would think so. But finding 3 showed that's not what happens. Investors apparently failed to incorporate this information into stock prices right away. There was a noticeable lag.
A lag. So the market is slow to pick up on the signal hidden in the footnotes.
That's what the evidence suggests. The value is there, but it takes time for the market to fully recognize it.
Okay, that really tees up the practical side. What does this mean for managers, for practitioners reading these reports?
It's hugely relevant. This study essentially maps out strategic behavior. After SFAS 141 gave managers more discretion, they started using disclosure as a tool, sometimes to signal quality, but often it seems to obscure potential bad news.
Especially that overpayment risk or the goodwill games.
Exactly. So if you're a manager, you know that being transparent might signal a good deal. But you also know that if you withhold information, the market probably won't punish you immediately.
That creates a bit of an uneven playing field, doesn't it? Investors seem functionally fixed, at least initially.
That's a good way to put it, functionally fixed. Practitioners, whether they're investors doing due diligence or advisors, need to realize this. When you do see comprehensive M&A notes, understand that the market might be undervaluing that transparency initially.
And conversely, maybe you should treat minimal disclosure with more suspicion.
Definitely. The level of disclosure in past deals could be a serious input into your risk assessment for future ones.
Okay, to really get into the nuts and bolts of how Shalev figured this out, we need to understand the tools. How did he actually measure disclosure level? It sounds subjective.
It could be, but they made it rigorous. They developed what's called the disclosure score, or DISC score. This involved meticulously hand-collecting data on up to 27 specific disclosure items required by SFAS 141 in the 10K footnotes for each deal.
27 items. Wow.
Yeah, it measures completeness.
Yeah.
How many of the required items did they actually disclose relative to what was possible for that specific transaction? It's a quantitative measure.
Got it. And how did they isolate that bad news component, the sort of questionable goodwill part?
That was clever. They used a measure called abnormal goodwill, ABGDWL. instead of just looking at the total goodwill number, which can be driven by lots of normal economic factors.
Like industry differences or growth prospects?
Exactly. They used regression analysis to predict what the goodwill should be based on those factors. ABGDWL is the part of goodwill that isn't explained by those normal drivers.
So it's the potentially strategic bit, the part that might represent overpayment or earnings management attempts.
That's the logic. It isolates the component most likely linked to the bad news managers might want to hide.
And the whole study seems grounded in voluntary disclosure theory, but with a twist, right?
Absolutely. Basic theory might suggest managers always reveal good news, but Shalev draws on extensions by folks like Verrecchia and Dye. Their work suggests that when information is complex or maybe proprietary,
Like M&A details offered are.
right, managers might actually optimally choose to withhold or delay bad news because the market might not immediately penalize them for the silence, given the complexity. That's the theoretical underpinning for predicting less disclosure signals trouble.
Interesting. Okay, one more concept before we hit the structured questions. Materiality. How did the study figure out what managers actually consider material enough to trigger disclosure?
They tested a few different size metrics. What really stood out was the purchase price relative to the acquirer's total assets, those standard thresholds like 5% or 10% of total assets.
The ones regulators often point to.
Those were the main drivers of disclosure decisions in the data, much more so than the absolute deal size or the deal size relative to the acquirer's market value. It suggests managers are really focused on that total assets benchmark.
Okay, that's a great foundation. Let's dive into our structured questions. Question 1. What is the specific research question and why is it so important, especially after SFAS 141 changed the rules?
So we've touched on it, but let's state it clearly. The questions are, what causes the variation in business combination disclosure levels? What are the effects of that variation on future performance? And do investors understand these effects promptly?
And the importance.
It comes down to economic significance. M&A deals are huge. They often dwarf a company's regular capital spending. Shalev's data showed way more large acquisitions, like over 10% of assets, than large cap X years.
So when you're talking about transactions that fundamentally reshape a company, the information quality is paramount.
Absolutely critical, especially because so much of the purchase price, around 84% on average in the sample, was allocated to intangible assets. SFAS 141 demanded more detail precisely because investors need to understand how these massive, often fuzzy intangible values will impact future earnings and cash flows.
But the managers hold the keys to that information.
They do, hence the importance of understanding their disclosure choices.
Okay, question 2. We talked about voluntary disclosure theory. Why the specific reliance on the extensions by Verrecchia and Dye for the hypotheses? Why wasn't the basic theory enough?
Because the basic models often assume information is simple and easily interpreted. If that were true, withholding information would immediately signal the worst, and the market would react negatively right away.
But M&A disclosures aren't simple.
Far from it. They are complex, involve estimations, proprietary details. Verrecchia and Dye's models incorporate these real-world frictions like the cost of revealing sensitive info, or just the sheer difficulty for investors to process it all.
So that complexity allows managers to withhold bad news without immediate punishment. That's the basis for predicting less disclosure signals problems, H1 and H2.
Exactly. It provides theoretical justification for why managers might strategically underdisclose bad news, knowing the market won't fully grasp the negative implications from silence alone, at least not instantly.
And that also supports the prediction for H3, that investors would be slow to react.
Yes, because the market might initially assume withheld info is bad if it were simple, but the complexity here allows managers to exploit the information processing lag.
That theoretical nuance really puts pressure on the research design. Which brings us to question 3. How did Shalev tackle validity? How did they ensure they were measuring the right things and isolating the manager's strategic intent, controlling for other factors?
Yeah, the design had to be robust. For construct validity measuring what they intended, using that detailed 27-item DIST score tied directly to SFAS 141 was key. It wasn't some vague measure, it was specific.
But the big hurdle is internal validity, right? Proving the cause, showing that low disclosure is driven by the deal's badness, not just, say, industry norms or company size.
Definitely. The star player here was using abnormal goodwill, ABGDWL. By design, it strips out the goodwill explained by normal economics. What's left, the residual, is argued to capture that strategic element, the overpayment or earnings management incentive. That helps isolate the bad news driver.
So it's a way to try and get at causality. even without a perfect experiment.
As close as you can often get in archival research. Plus, they used industry fixed effects to control for differences in disclosure norms or proprietary costs across sectors.
And they didn't stop there. They also had to address non-random assignment. The fact that companies choosing to disclose less might just be different types of companies to begin with.
Right. So the regression models included a whole battery of control variables. Firm size, whether the deal used stock, CEO stock compensation, different types of institutional ownership, analyst following.
Trying to make sure the results weren't just picking up, say, that high-growth firms with risk-taking CEOs naturally disclose less anyway.
Exactly. It's about statistically controlling for those other potential explanations to bolster the claim that it's the deal characteristics driving the disclosure choice.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move to question 4. What specific statistical methods did they use, and how did those methods help confirm some of those design choices, like focusing on certain materiality metrics?
The workhorse methods were industry fixed effects regressions. They used these to test Hypothesis 1, what determines disclosure, and Hypothesis 2, how disclosure affects future performance, like ROA.
Standard approach for this kind of question. What about the market reaction tests?
For that, they used event study methodology, calculating abnormal stock returns around the 10K filing date, using the FAMA and French three-factor model to benchmark expected returns.
And you mentioned earlier the methods also helped validate their focus. How did that work?
Well, they ran specific tests on those different materiality metrics we discussed. The regression showed very clearly that the purchase price relative to total assets, especially that 10% threshold, was a highly significant predictor of disclosure.
Well, other metrics weren't as strong.
Right. Things like the absolute dollar value of the deal or the deal size relative to market cap weren't significant once you controlled for the total assets thresholds. This gave them confidence that focusing on the total assets materiality definition was reflecting actual managerial behavior.
Okay, crunch time. Question 5. What were the major results? Did they actually find support for their hypotheses and answer the core research questions? Let's focus on the direction and significance, not necessarily the exact numbers.
Absolutely. Result 1, testing the determinants, H1. Yes, they found statistically significant negative relationship between abnormal goodwill, ABGWL, and the disclosure score.
Meaning more questionable goodwill led to less disclosure.
Precisely. They also found less disclosure was linked to other proxies for earnings management, like meeting analyst forecasts frequently. So yes, evidence supports strategic concealment of bad news.
Okay, so the cause part of the question gets a yes. What about the effect on performance? H2.
Result 2, yes again. They found a significant positive relationship between their measure of abnormal disclosure, ABDIC, and future performance. Both changes in ROA in the following year and long-term abnormal stock returns were higher for firms with abnormally high disclosure.
So transparency predicted future success answers the effect part.
It does. The disclosure level clearly contained valuable forward-looking information.
And the final piece, investor reaction. H3. Did the market get it right away?
Result 3, a clear no. The analysis of short window abnormal returns around the 10K filing showed no significant association with the abnormal disclosure measure. The coefficient was tiny and statistically insignificant.
So the market was essentially asleep at the switch.
At that specific point in time, yes. So overall, the results strongly support the narrative. Managers withhold bad news. The disclosure level is informative about future value, but investors miss that information initially.
Which brings us neatly to the final question, question 6. What are the main conclusions the authors draw? And crucially, are these conclusions really warranted given the theory, the design, and the results we've just discussed?
The main conclusion is straightforward. Acquirers strategically withhold valuable information, specifically bad news, linked to goodwill and potential overpayment, and the market fails to fully impound this information when the disclosure, or lack thereof, actually happens in the 10K.
And is that conclusion justified?
I'd say yes, very strongly warranted. The combination of finding that disclosure predicts future performance, H2, but not immediate market reaction, H3, is powerful evidence of delayed information processing.
It's the disconnect between long-term value and short-term reaction.
Exactly. And the careful construction of the abnormal goodwill measure, plus the extensive controls, really strengthens the argument that they've isolated a genuine strategic behavior linked to bad news, not just some random correlation.
It really feels like the complexity argument from Dye's theory holds water here. The M&A notes are dense, maybe too dense for the market to parse quickly.
That seems like a very plausible explanation. It's not necessarily that the market is irrational forever, but it appears functionally fixed when faced with this kind of complex, footnote-heavy information right at the filing date.
This study also highlights issues with how materiality is judged in practice, doesn't it? You mentioned inconsistencies.
Yes, that's a significant side point. The authors noted finding many cases, over 200 in their sample, where a firm would disclose one key item like the purchase price allocation detail, but not another required item like the pro forma income statement or vice versa.
Even within the same deal's disclosure.
Within the same deal. It suggests materiality judgments aren't just varying across firms, but sometimes inconsistently applied within a single firm's reporting for one transaction. It makes you wonder about the effectiveness of principles-based standards if the application is that uneven.
A sobering thought for standard setters and auditors.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a final, quite provocative thought to chew on. The analysis hinted that while the market is slow overall, it might actually adapt more quickly to firms with low abnormal disclosure.
Meaning it punishes the non-disclosures relatively faster than it rewards the transparent ones.
That seems to be the suggestion. It takes longer for the market to fully price in the positive signal from high disclosure. So the question for you, the listener, is why this asymmetry?
Why is the market seemingly quicker to react to negative signals, or lack thereof, than to positive ones in this context?
Right. What does that tell us about investor focus? Is it more about risk avoidance than seeking alpha in M&A notes? And what other mechanisms, maybe analyst calls, subsequent earnings reports, eventually bridge that gap and make the stock price reflect the long-run performance signaled by the initial disclosure level?
Fascinating questions. It implies the 10K filing is just the start of the information discovery process, not the end.
Precisely. There's a whole subsequent process of sense-making that happens.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you for bringing this paper and guiding us through it. A real deep dive into strategic disclosure.
Thanks for tuning into the Lion's Share podcast. If you enjoyed today's discussion, share it with a friend and join us next time for more ideas worth talking about. We'll see you next time.